The gavel came down on Roland Pruitt's own advice 11 years before copper was ever born, and Roland had never once let himself forget the sound of it. Wisconsin, spring 1959. He'd been 31 that year, newer to serious breeding than he liked to admit, still building the kind of reputation a man earns by being useful to his neighbors, rather than by having proven anything grand on his own account yet. Otto, 2 farms over, had a heifer calf born with a strange, patchy, dun coloring nobody in the county had a proper name for, and had asked Roland, young, careful, already known locally for a good eye, what he made of her. Roland had looked that calf over for the better part of an hour and told Otto the same thing every experienced breeder in the state would have told him. An unusual coat like that one almost never comes alone. Something in the genetics is off, even if you can't see the rest of it yet. Cull her now, clean, and don't spend 2 years feeding a bet against your own herd's reputation. Otto had culled her that same week. Nobody ever found out whether Roland had been right, because there was nothing left standing to test. He thought about that calf more than he ever told anyone. 11 years of it sitting quiet in the back of his mind, the way a debt sits quiet on a ledger nobody's called due yet. And in March of 1970, standing in his own birthing stall over a bull calf born the wrong color, the thought arrived before the calf had even found its legs. Don't be the reason this happens twice. Not sick, not weak, red. A deep, unmistakable copper red from nose to tail, where a proper Holstein calf sired by his best bull and his best cow should have come black and white. No argument, no room for interpretation. Roland had bred dairy cattle for 22 years by then, built a modest, respected herd on patient line breeding, and he knew exactly what that coat meant to every judge and every artificial insemination company that might ever look at this bull for stud. He also knew, because he'd spent 11 years quietly turning the same question over in his own head, that the thing every breeder in this county believed about an odd coat, that it never comes alone, that something deeper always rides along with it, was a claim Roland himself had once repeated with total confidence to a neighbor about an animal he'd never actually gotten the chance to be proven right or wrong about, because the animal was gone before the question could be answered. He knelt down next to the calf, ran his hand along a chest already showing real depth, legs already square and solid under him faster than most calves managed. The coat was wrong by every visible standard the breed recognized. Nothing else about this calf was. And this time, Roland intended to actually find out how the rest of the story went, instead of ending it early by habit the way he had the last time this exact choice had landed in front of him. He named the calf Copper. He did not call the association that week the way convention expected. If you've ever caught yourself standing right at the edge of repeating the exact mistake you swore you'd learned from the last time, I think you already know something about the story I'm about to tell you. I'd love to hear about it if you're willing, down in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from too. I read every one, and I like knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. Word moved fast, the way it always did in that county, and it reached Vernon Kettering within the week, a respected regional Holstein classifier, 19 years into a career built on the particular certainty of a man who'd made the same visual judgment call 10,000 times and never once had real reason to doubt it. Vernon drove out that Saturday, hat pushed back, and didn't waste time getting to it. "Heard you're keeping the red one." He looked through the stall rails without getting out of the truck right away. "That's true, Roland?" "That's true." "You know what that coat does to a bull's stud value before anybody even looks at the rest of him. Every AI company in this region passes sight unseen. The color alone ends the conversation before it starts." Vernon finally stepped down, walked to the rail, and gave the calf the flat, thorough scan of a man who'd made this exact assessment more times than he could count. "And it's not only the coat, Roland. Red factor doesn't come alone, not in my experience. Weak pasterns, soft top lines, poor rib depth, the whole confirmation package tends to ride in with it. I've watched it prove out that way enough times to trust it without needing to watch it prove out again. He's got good depth of chest, Vernon. Legs are square, nothing soft about how he's standing at 4 days old. 4 days doesn't tell you what 2 years will. Vernon said it without any real unkindness, the settled, weary certainty of a man repeating something he'd watched confirm itself across 2 decades of judging. I'm not telling you to call him outright if you're attached to him. I'm telling you not to fool yourself into thinking you're sitting on something special. You're sitting on a novelty, and a costly one, and this industry doesn't pay novelty prices. Roland didn't argue, because arguing with a classifier gave the man a sharper story to tell at the next farm he visited, and because some part of him recognized uncomfortably that he was listening to a slightly older version of his own younger voice, the one that had told Otto Reinke almost the identical thing 11 years before. What Roland didn't say to Vernon that morning, and hadn't said to anyone in 11 years, was that he still thought about that dun heifer more often than he let on. Whether she'd have thrown good calves, whether Otto's whole herd might look different now if Roland had told him something other than what every other breeder in the state would have told him too. He'd never gone back to ask Otto how he felt about it, all these years later. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Roland's brother-in-law, a big, plain-spoken man named Herschel Doss, who ran a considerably larger operation 2 farms over, said what half the county was already saying, with less patience than Vernon had shown. "You're going to feed that bull 2 years to prove a point nobody's going to thank you for," Herschel said, leaning on the fence, arms crossed. "I run 300 head, Roland. You run 60. I can absorb a bad bet like this without missing a payment. You can't, and you know it better than I do." "I know the math, Herschel." "Knowing it and acting like you know it are 2 different things." "Maybe they are. Doesn't mean I've got a different answer to give you yet." Herschel shook his head and left without pressing further, though he came back around most weeks that spring. Anyway, the particular loyalty of a man who thought his brother-in-law was making a mistake and showed up regardless. It was 3 weeks after Copper's birth that Roland finally did the thing he'd been circling for 11 years without quite admitting it to himself. He drove over to Otto Reinke's place on a Sunday afternoon unannounced and found the old man out front repairing a gate hinge, 71 now and slower than Roland remembered him. "Otto?" Roland stood at the fence a moment before he said anything else. "I want to ask you something, and I'd understand if you'd rather not talk about it. That dun heifer, back in '59, the one I told you to cull." Otto looked up, set his tools down, and was quiet a moment. Not the offended kind of quiet, just the kind that comes from being asked, out of nowhere, about something he hadn't expected anyone to bring up again after this long. "I think about her some still. Wondered plenty of times what she'd have thrown. But I want to tell you something you maybe don't know, Roland, and I don't say it to make you feel worse. I'd already half decided to cull her before I asked you a single thing. I wanted somebody to agree with me, not somebody to talk me out of it. You gave me the answer I was already leaning toward, same as most men do when they ask advice they've already made their mind up about." He picked his tools back up. "I've carried that same thought around 11 years too, if it helps any. You're not the only one it costs something to." It didn't fully undo 11 years of quiet wait, hearing that. But it shifted it from a debt Roland owed entirely to a decision he'd only half owned in the first place, alongside a man who'd never once said so out loud until asked directly. "I've got a red bull calf now, same shape of question. I don't intend to answer it the same way twice." "Didn't figure you would, coming out here to ask me about the last one." Otto almost smiled at that. "Go on and find out properly this time. Somebody ought to." Copper grew the way his chest had promised from the first morning. Deep, solid, moving with an ease in the joints that matched nothing Vernon had predicted about soft conformation riding along with the red gene. Roland measured him every month with the same careful discipline he applied to every animal in his herd. Weight, rib depth, leg angle, gait at a walk and a trot, writing it all down in a notebook he'd started the week after visiting Otto. Not just for Copper, but for every red factor animal he could get information about from breeders willing to talk about it privately. the ones too embarrassed to admit to the association they'd ever kept one past weaning. By midsummer, the notebook held entries on 9 different red factor animals across 4 counties. Of the 9, only one besides copper had ever been kept long enough to be measured properly before being sold off cheap or cold outright. And that one had scored solidly average on every confirmation metric that had nothing to do with color. It wasn't proof. 9 animals, most culled too early for real data, wasn't a study. But it was enough to make Roland genuinely doubt the thing he himself had once stated as settled fact to Otto. And doubting it properly this time, on paper, with real numbers, felt different from simply hoping his own bull might be the exception. At the co-op that August, the talk had settled into something between a joke and a running commentary. "Pruitt's still feeding that red bull," a man said loud enough to carry the way such comments always were. 22 years breeding good cattle, and now he's keeping a coat color mistake out of pure stubbornness." Roland paid his feed and said nothing, and drove home with his jaw tight. Not because the comment was cruel, but because it landed exactly on the question he still hadn't fully answered for himself. Whether this time was genuinely different, or whether he was simply repeating his own old mistake in reverse, keeping an animal out of guilt this time instead of culling one out of habit. Neither choice actually being about the animal in front of him. The real cost showed itself plainly that autumn, in numbers rather than gossip. Every serious breeding operation Roland approached, 4 of them, all companies who might ordinarily have paid real money for stud rights to a bull with copper's underlying numbers, declined before ever running a single test, the coat alone ending the conversation exactly the way Vernon had predicted it would. Roland sat with his accounts one night, the equipment repairs he'd budgeted against expected stud income now sitting unfunded, and let himself genuinely consider, for the first time since Copper's birth, that his own small notebook and his own quiet doubt might simply not be enough to outweigh what an entire industry had already decided on sight. He didn't call anyone to arrange a cull. Instead, the following week, he did something he'd never done in 22 years of running his own operation. He asked Herschel directly for a short-term loan against the coming year's milk contract, plain and unadorned, no land changing hands, no quiet transaction nobody had to explain. Herschel sat with the request a long moment. "You're asking me for money to keep feeding a bull I told you not to keep." "I am." "That's a hell of a thing to ask a man who thinks you're making a mistake." "I know it is." Roland didn't dress it up further than that. "I'm asking anyway because I'd rather owe you honestly than solve this quiet and alone, same as I've been doing with everything else about this bull so far." Herschel studied him a moment, something shifting slightly in his face. Not agreement exactly, but a kind of respect for being asked plainly instead of finding out sideways the way the county usually did things. "I'll carry you through winter. Interest at the bank's rate, nothing friendlier than that, because I don't want you thinking I'm agreeing with your judgment. I'm agreeing to be your brother-in-law about it. Different thing." "That's more than fair." That winter, with the loan carrying him through the leanest months, Roland drove back out to Otto's place once more, this time bringing his own notebook along, the 9 entries and Copper's own numbers laid out plain. He wasn't looking for permission. He wanted, he realized on the drive over, simply to show the old man that the question was actually being answered this time, properly, instead of assumed. Otto read through the pages slowly, the way a man reads something he's waited a long while to see. "Wish I'd known there was a way to actually find this out back when it might have mattered for that heifer of mine." He handed the notebook back. "No use in wishing on it now, but I'll tell you this much. Whatever this bull turns out to be, you keep this notebook going. Somebody in this county ought to have one, and it might as well be the one man who already knows exactly what it costs not to." The turning point arrived the following spring, quiet and almost accidental the way most real turns in that county tended to. A larger regional breeding cooperative, run by a pragmatic operations manager named Alma Weyerhaeuser, had spent 2 frustrating years watching her cooperative's approved stud line throw calves that looked exactly correct on paper and performed exactly average in the parlor, a run of disappointing numbers that had already cost her real credibility with her own board, who'd approved that stud line largely on her recommendation. She'd heard secondhand about a red factor bull 2 farms over that a stubborn breeder had refused to cull, and drove out herself that April, unannounced, less out of open-mindedness than out of a plain need to find something, anything that might explain what her own approved bulls weren't delivering. She walked Copper's pen a long while, ran her own measurements, and said little until she was ready. "I don't put much stock in coat color," Alma said finally. "What I put stock in is data, and I understand you've got some." She looked at Roland directly. "I want to run a controlled test, breed him into a deliberately varied set of cows from our own herd, and track every calf's actual conformation against our approved stud line. No assumptions either direction. If I'm wrong, I've spent a modest fee proving myself wrong. If I'm right, I've found something this industry has been culling out of pure habit longer than either of us has been alive." She paused. "I'll be honest with you about why I'm here, since you'll likely hear the rest from somebody eventually anyway. My board's asking me hard questions about the stud line I put my name behind. I need an answer more than I need to be right about where it comes from." Roland handed over the notebook. Alma read it twice before she said anything more. "This isn't proof, 9 animals, most culled too early for good data, but it's the first real attempt anybody's made to test the claim instead of just repeating it." "He's yours to test, same fee you'd pay for any bull in that class." The results came back over the following 2 breeding seasons, unambiguous. Across 14 calves sired by Copper into Alma's test herd, conformation scores ran statistically identical to the cooperative's approved black and white stud line. No measurable difference in leg angle, rib depth, or top line strength. The coat, as far as 14 calves and 2 full seasons of careful measurement could show, predicted nothing about conformation at all. It predicted only itself. Alma brought the full dataset to the cooperative's board that winter and to the regional association's own review committee the following spring, and the numbers did for her what she'd come looking for in the first place. Her board's hard questions turned within a season into a formal request that she expand the Red Factor test program cooperative-wide. And the woman who'd driven out to Roland's place half out of professional desperation left that review with the strongest footing she'd had with her own board in 2 years. Vernon Kettering was on that review committee, and he read the full report twice before he said anything to anyone about it. He drove out to Roland's place that same week, on foot from the road, which Roland noticed since Vernon never walked anywhere he could drive. "I've spent 19 years telling breeders in this county something I genuinely believed was true. Turns out I was repeating something nobody had actually tested properly in this region, because everybody culled the animals that would have let anybody test it before they ever got old enough to prove it either way." He was quiet a moment. "I've built a fair amount of my own reputation on being the man whose eye you could trust on sight. Numbers like Alma's leave me much room to keep believing that the same way." "I'm not asking the association to apologize to me, Vernon." "I know you're not." Vernon looked at Copper a long moment. "Doesn't mean I'm not going to have to answer for it anyway at the next review meeting. That's going to cost me something, Vernon. Might cost me the seat outright, depending how the board wants to handle it. I won't pretend otherwise." "I didn't expect that and didn't have an immediate answer for it." "No, you set out to keep an honest bull and find out the truth about him, same as any good breeder ought to. The costing me something part is just what happens sometimes when the truth turns out different than what a man spent his whole career being paid to say with certainty." He turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I heard you went and talked to Otto Ranke this past year about that old heifer. Otto mentioned it to me himself, matter of fact, a few months back, though I didn't understand at the time why it seemed to matter to him so much that you'd asked." "It mattered to me more than it probably should have." "Maybe not. Or maybe that's exactly the kind of thing that ought to matter to a man if he wants to keep being worth listening to. Vernon nodded once and walked back toward the road the way he'd come. The Regional Association's review committee met that June. Vernon kept his classifier position, but the board formally opened a review of the visual standards weighting relative to production data, citing Alma's study by name in the committee minutes. It would take 3 more years before the standard was formally revised, but the revision traced back plainly in the association's own written record to 14 calves and 1 small breeder's notebook. Herschel came by that same summer, leaned against the same rail he'd leaned against with plain skepticism 2 years before, and watched Copper a while before he said anything. "Paid me back the loan early," he said. "Didn't have to say anything else about it, but I've been turning something over since, and I might as well say it while I'm standing here." He was quiet a beat, working it loose. "I've spent my whole life running the bigger operation, the safer bet, 300 head instead of 60, and I always figured that meant I understood risk better than you did. Turns out, you understood something about it I never bothered learning, that the safest bet isn't always the same thing as the right one, and the man can run 300 head his whole life and never once find that out, if he's careful enough to never be tested." He didn't quite look at Roland when he said the rest. "I'd like breeding rights once demand catches up with the data. Same fair price as anyone. And I'd like you to know I'm not asking because the numbers finally convinced me. I'm asking because watching you ask me for that loan straight out, instead of solving it quiet the way you'd have done with anything else, taught me something about you I hadn't bothered to notice in 20 years of being related to you." Roland hadn't expected that either. "Same fair price as anyone," he agreed, and let the rest of it sit between them without needing to be answered further. Have you ever been given a second chance to answer the exact question you got wrong once before, and found that the fear of repeating the old mistake almost became its own kind of mistake, just pointed in the opposite direction? I think anyone who's ever tried to make up for something quietly, without ever quite saying out loud what they were making up for, knows that particular kind of arithmetic. The one where good intentions and honest judgment turn out to be 2 different things, and only one of them is guaranteed to get you the right answer. By the 5th year, Copper's offspring were being requested by breeding programs across 3 states. Roland never expanded past his original 60 head. He did add a second, smaller breeding pen specifically for red factor animals other breeders now brought him deliberately. The same notebook method grown over 5 years into records 3 separate cooperatives consulted more readily than the association's own historical scoring guides. Alma's own cooperative-wide red factor program, born out of that first desperate April visit, became the model 2 other regional cooperatives eventually adopted outright, and Alma mailed Roland a short note the year it happened. No visit this time. Just a few plain lines, letting him know that the bull she'd come to test half out of necessity had ended up outlasting the very stud line she'd once needed him to help explain away. Vernon Kettering retired from the classifier role 2 years after the review, by his own choice, and told Roland once, plainly, over coffee at the co-op the week before he stepped down, that 19 years of being the man whose certainty nobody questioned had made him, in the end, a worse judge of cattle than a small breeder with a notebook and a debt to an old neighbor he'd finally gone and settled properly. Roland drove out to see Otto one more time that same year, not to ask him anything this time, just to tell him how it had turned out. Otto listened to the whole thing, nodded slowly, and said only, "Glad one of us finally got to find out." Neither man mentioned the dun heifer again after that, not because it no longer mattered, but because it finally didn't need to be brought up to be understood between them. Roland kept Copper on the place until the old bull died at 14, and by then his line ran through better than 60 calves across a dozen operations. Roland never called it vindication, not once. He didn't have to. The notebook said everything that needed saying, and so, in its own quiet way, had the conversation with Otto Reinke that started it. This is FarmLore, where we tell the kind of stories the land doesn't let go of easy. If a story like this stayed with you, there's more of this county's history waiting. They called him a defect because of the one thing that never actually mattered. Roland had gotten that answer wrong once before, for a different animal, for a different neighbor, 11 years before he ever got the chance to ask the question properly. This time, he made sure he did.